The Satanic Mill by Otfried Preussler. The second year, 7, wine and water. They began to build the water wheel at the end of June. Krabbet helped Stashko measure the old mill wheel, since the new one must be exactly the same in all its parts. When they finished, they were going to fit it on the existing axle tree. Their carpenter's shop was behind the stable, between the barn and the shed, and they spent all their time there now, making the wheel, the spokes, and the felloes forming the outer rim, the paddles and the pegs that held them in place. Stashko showed them how to do it. Everything must be just right, he told his assistants, or we'll be a laughing stock the day we set the new wheel in place. It was light until late in the evening now, and in fine weather the miller's men would often sit out of doors outside the mill while Andrush played his Jew's harp. These days Krabbet felt he would like to go to Schwarzkolm again. Maybe the singer would be sitting outside her house. Maybe she would wave and reply to his greeting as he went by, or perhaps she was with the other village girls, and they were singing again. Many evenings when the wind was blowing from Schwarzkolm, he thought he could hear singing in the distance, but that couldn't really be possible, not with the wood in between. If he could only find some excuse to get away, a good innocent reason that would not arouse even Leishko's suspicions, it was possible that such a reason might present itself some day, and then he would not be making suspicions and so placing the girl in danger. When all was said and done, he knew very little about her. He knew what she looked like now, the way she walked and held her head, and the sound of her voice. He knew all this as well as if he had always known it. He knew, too, that he could never put her out of his mind and out of his life again, no more than he could banish the memory of Tonda. Yet he did not even know her name. Now and then he wondered what it was, and it gave him pleasure to think of a name for her. Milenka. Radushka. Dushenka was a good name. It would suit her. And it's as well I don't know her real name, thought Krabbet, for if I don't know it, I can't give it away, not awake nor in my sleep, as Tonda made me promise. It seems 1,000 years ago that we sat by the fire that Easter night, he and I. Krabbet still had not visited Tonda's grave. One summer's day he woke at the first light of dawn, stole out of the mill, and went out into the fen. There were dewdrops hanging on every blade of grass and every twig, and wherever Krabbet passed he left a dark trail in the grass behind him. At sunrise he came to the edge of the waste ground, not far from the spot where he and Tonda first reached firm land when they were coming back from the peat cutting. On the way, Krabbet had picked a few ragged robin flowers from the bank of a pool in the swamp to put on Tonda's grave, but when he saw the row of long, low mounds ahead of him in the morning sunlight, they were all alike. There was no way to tell them apart. Was Tonda buried to the left of the row or the right? And the mounds were not evenly spaced. It could be that Tonda's grave lay somewhere in the middle. Krabbet was at a loss. He could not remember anything that might give him a clue. The day they buried Tonda, everything around them had been white, covered with snow. That's that, then, he thought. He walked slowly past the mounds, laying a flower on each one. At the end, there was one flower left over. He twisted its stem in his fingers and said, looking down at it, "For the next man we bury here." He let the flower fall, and it was only then, in the brief time it took to reach the ground, that he realized what he had just said. He felt a thrill of horror, but there was no one saying it now, and the flower lay where it fell, at the far end of the row, between the mound on the extreme right and the wood. Back in the mill, no one seemed to know where Krabbet had been, yet someone had been watching him secretly after all. Michael. That evening he spoke to Krabbet in private. "The dead are dead," said Michael. "I told you so once before, and tell you so again. Those who die at the mill in the fen of Kassel are forgotten as if they had never been. That's the only way the others can go on living, and life must go on. Promise me to remember that." "I promise," said Krabbet, and he nodded. But even as he nodded, he knew he neither could nor would keep that promise. Work on the new water wheel took a full 3 weeks in all. They did not use a single nail. The parts were all made to fit exactly and mortised together. Later, when they brought the wheel to the water, the tenons would swell and hold better than any glue. For the last time, Stashko checked that the measurements were all exact and nothing left undone. Then he went to tell the master that the wheel was ready. The master fixed the next Wednesday as the day to set the wheel in place. By rights, he ought now to have sent word to the other millers in those parts, inviting them and their journeymen to his mill on the great day. That was the custom, but the master of the mill in the fen did not hold with such customs, and he did not care to hang, and he did not care a hang for the other millers.
"What do we want with strange folks at our mill?" said he. "We can set the wheel in place well enough by ourselves."
Stashko, Krabbit, and Kitto had plenty to do before Wednesday. The old water wheel and the tail race had to be covered with good strong scaffolding. They had to see that the ropes, winch, and pulley were in order, and to provide poles on which to carry the wheel, levers, and so forth. On Tuesday evening, the miller's men wove leaves through the spokes of the new wheel, and Stashko added a few flowers as a finishing touch. He was proud of his work and didn't mind showing it. Wednesday began with bacon cakes for breakfast. "Thinks I to myself, you'll get down to work better with something good inside you," said Juro as he served them out. "Now, so eat your fill, but don't overeat now." After breakfast, they went off to their carpenter's shop, where they found the master waiting for them. They passed poles through the wheel, as Stashko had shown them, 3 on one side of the hub and 3 on the other. "Ready?" called Stashko. "Ready," cried the miller and his men. "Good luck, then. Off we go. Lift away." So they carried the wheel off to the mill race and put it down on the grass beside the scaffolding. "Gently now," said Stashko. "Take it easy, mind it doesn't slip out of joint." Michael and Merton clambered up on the scaffolding, and with the help of the pulley and several ropes, they shifted the axle tree and secured it to the crossbeam behind the old wheel. Now, using poles and levers, the men lifted the mill wheel off the axle and out of the tail race and carried it away. The new water wheel was set upright, brought over to the tail race, and lowered into it until the hub was level with the axle tree. Now they had to fit the hub of the wheel onto the axle. Stashko was sweating with excitement. He had climbed right down into the tail race, along with Andrush, and was issuing orders from there. "Over to the left a bit. Take it slowly. Now a little lower. To the right. Mind you don't topple it over." Up until now, all had gone well, but suddenly Andrew stuck his hands together and uttered an oath. "Just look at that," he called to Stashko. "See what a mess you made of it." And he pointed to the hole in the middle of the hub. "You might get a broomstick through it maybe, but the axle will never fit." Stashko, horrified, went red as fire. He had measured everything so carefully and precisely, and in spite of that, the hole in the hub was far too small, so small that even Juro couldn't help but see it. I can't understand it," stammered Stashko. "Can't you?" answered Andrush. "Not for the life of me." "Well, I can," said Andrush, grinning. By now the others had all realized he was just playing a trick on Stashko. He snapped his fingers, and at once everything was all right again. The hole in the hub was the right size, and when they placed the wheel on the axle, it fitted like a glove. Stashko bore Andrush no ill will for his trick. He was glad the most difficult part of the job was over. By comparison, the rest was child's play. They restored the axle to its usual position and took the ropes away. Then the wheel was driven firmly onto the axle tree and the wedges knocked in. A few blows with the mallet and it was done. The miller had been lending a hand, like all the others. Now he climbed up on the scaffolding and told Juro to bring him some wine. Standing above the tail race, the master raised his tankard, drank to his men, and poured the rest of his wine over the garlanded wheel. First wine, then water," he cried. "Start it going." Hanzo opened the sluice, and to the acclamation of the miller's men, the new wheel began to go round. After their work, the men carried the long table and the benches from the servants' hall out to the yard in front of the mill, and Leishko helped Vitko bring out the master's armchair, which they set at the head of the table. Then they washed in the mill pond, and while the other men cleaned up and put fresh shirts and smocks, Juro was making the final preparations for a festive meal. There was roast meat and wine to celebrate the setting of the new wheel in place. They sat out in the open until late in the evening. The master was in a good mood and feeling talkative. He praised Stashko and his assistants for their work, and even had a good word for stupid Juro. He told him the roast was excellent and the wine did him good. He sang and cracked jokes with his men, urged them to drink, and he himself drank most of all. "Be merry,"
he shouted. "Be merry, my lads. Anyone who saw you might well be envious. You don't know your luck."
"What? Us?" cried Andrews, clapping a hand to his head. "Listen to that, friends. The master envies us."
"I envy you your youth."
All of a sudden the master was serious, but not for long. He began to tell them a story of days when he himself was a journeyman miller and about Krabbit's age.
"I had a good friend in those days called Jerko. We learned our trade together at the mill in Comaru, and then we went on our travels together all over Lusatia, into Schleswig, as far as Bohemia. When we came to a miller's place, we always asked if he had work for the two of us. It would never be done for us to be separated. It would never have done for us to be separated, Jerko and I. It was better to stick together and marry her too. Jerko always saw that we had something to laugh at. And how he could work. He could work for 3 if he had to. As for the way the girls ran after us, you'd never believe it."
The master was in full swing. Now and then he paused to drink, and then picked up the thread of his story again and went on. He told how one day he and Jerko came to a black school, how they spent 7 years learning the magic arts, and when that time was over, they began to travel around the country once again.
"And so," said the master, "we took service at a mill near Coswig, and the elector came riding by with a hunting party one day and stopped to rest in the meadow behind the mill pond in the shade of the trees. We journeymen, Jerko and myself included, stood behind the bushes watching them eat. 2 servants had spread a tablecloth on the grass, and the elector and his guests sat around it and ate from silver plates which the servants put before them. There were quail pasties with truffles and game, and 3 sorts of wine to drink, and after that there were sweetmeats, and they had brought it all with them in enormous baskets loaded on pack horses. Well, when the elector, he was a young man himself at the time, when he and the ladies and gentlemen had had enough to eat, he gave a loud belch just to show he'd eaten well. Then he said this meal out of doors had done him so much good, he felt as strong as 12 oxen, and seeing us young fellows standing gaping in the bushes, he shouted out to us for someone to bring him a horseshoe, and quickly, or he'd burst with his own strength. We knew that the elector was said to be able to break a horseshoe with his bare hands, crack, right down the middle, so we could guess why he wanted one, and Juro ran to the mill and fetched him a horseshoe from the stable. "Here you are, your most serene highness." The elector grasped the horseshoe by both ends. The huntsmen, who were sitting a little way off with the horses and hounds, had already jumped up, pursed their lips and raised their horns, and at the moment when the elector broke the horseshoe, they began to blow with all their might, puffing out their cheeks like bellows, to the sound of the hunting horns. The elector held up the 2 halves of the horseshoe and showed them to the company. Then he asked the gentlemen in his hunting party if any of them could do it. Well, they all said no to that, but Jerko was feeling his oats. He went right up to the elector and claimed, "By your leave, I can do better than that. I can put the horseshoe together again." "Any blacksmith can do as much," said the elector. "With a pair of bellows and a fire in the forge, yes," Juro grants him, "not with his bare hands." Without waiting for the elector's reply, he just took the 2 halves of the horseshoe away from him, then pressed the broken surfaces together. He spoke a charm. "There, if it please you," he said. The elector snatched the shoe out of his hand and examined it. It was whole again, all in a piece. "Humph," growled the elector. "You can't fool us into thinking that will hold." He tried to break the horseshoe for the 2nd time, thinking it couldn't be hard to do. But he was reckoning without Jerko. He tugged and tugged at the shoe until the veins of his throat stood out like ropes. Sweat was dripping from his brow and his eyes were bulging out of his head. First he went red in the face as a turkey cock, then purple and finally dark blue. His lips were white with the strain, thin and white as 2 chalk lines. Then suddenly His Highness the Elector dropped the horseshoe and was yellow as a quince with anger. "To horse!" he ordered. "We ride on." His most serene highness was so unsteady on his feet he could hardly get into the saddle, and ever after that he gave the mill near Coswig a very wide berth. The master went on drinking and telling tales of his life when he was a young man, and tales of Jerko, until Michael asked him what had become of this Jerko. By then it was too late. The stars were in the sky, and the moon was rising behind the stable roof. "What became of Jerko?" The master clapped his tankard with both hands. I brought him to his death. That made the young men sit up. Yes, I brought him to his death, repeated the master, and one of these days I'll tell you how it happened. But now I'm thirsty. More wine, more wine.
The master drank steadily on without another word until he fell back in his chair, rigid as a corpse. The sight of him filled the men with dread. They could not bring themselves to carry him into the house. They left him sitting there until he woke of his own accord next morning and crawled off to bed. And that's the end of chapter 7.